Welcome to the Sacramento County Child, Family, and Adult Services Policy and Procedure Training on client access to effective language services, auxiliary aids, alternative services, and reasonable accommodations. This policy outlines providing access to effective language services, auxiliary aids, alternative services, and reasonable accommodations to any person involved in DCFAS referrals and cases and the process for documenting these services. Regulations. California Department of Social Services Manual of Policies and Procedures, Division 21 regulations require all county welfare agencies ensure bilingual, Braille, and sign language services are provided to serve limited English and non-English speaking persons and individuals with vision or hearing impairment in a timely manner. This includes the following areas: bilingual staffing, interpreter services, use of translated forms, notices, and materials, auxiliary aids, and alternative services. Reasonable accommodation is offered and provided to any person involved with DCFAS referrals and cases. Child Protective Services Division and Senior and Adult Services Division, including Adult Protective Services and in-home support services, are subject to Division 21 regulations. Special Skills Language and Culture. Division 21 regulations require the department provide a sufficient number of qualified bilingual and/or culture employees assigned to public contact positions in each program and/or location serving at least 5% of non-English speaking persons and/or any particular culture. This includes clerical, social worker, and family service worker employees. Interpreter services. When a non-English, limited English-speaking, or hearing-impaired person requests services in another language, employees must offer or provide interpreter services in the language the person specified for oral communication. Interpreter services may be provided in person or by telephone using a bilingual staff person who is acting as an interpreter and is certified, a contracted interpreter, or a family member or friend. When using an outside interpreter, the interpreter shall be made aware of topics being discussed and that they are confidential and may be sensitive in nature, and the information is not to be discussed outside of the interview. When using a family member or friend, the customer may be advised that there may be potential problems of ineffective communication, including confidential information and sensitive topics being discussed. Minor children may be used to interpret in extenuating circumstances or at a person's request, including a medical emergency, determining the person's language needs, and there is no alternative services available. Use of translated forms, notices, and materials. When an employee uses a form, notice, or other written material required by CDSS in delivery of services, the employee must use the appropriate CDSS translation of the form when serving persons who are non-English or limited English speaking. CDSS publications and forms. The Pub 13 is called Your Rights Under California Welfare Programs and must be provided at the first in-person contact, reinvestigation, or recertification for CPS and SAS IHSS referrals or cases. The form is available in 18 threshold languages translated by CDSS. The Pub 470 is called Your Rights Under Adult Protective Services Programs and must be provided at the first in-person contact, reinvestigation for SAS, APS, referrals, and cases. The form is available in 18 threshold languages translated by CDSS. Auxiliary aids and services. Employees shall provide auxiliary aids and/or services to persons who are deaf or hearing impaired, or persons with impaired speech, vision, or manual skills where necessary, to afford the person an equal opportunity to participate in any program services or activities. Here is a list of some examples of auxiliary aids and services. Please note, some require a person to possess certain equipment or computer software. Sign language interpreters, video relay service, Braille materials if requested and available, large print materials if requested. You can also use the copier to enlarge print to a person's preference. Recorded information as available. Reading documents to a person. follow up on mailed notices with a phone call to read notices to a person, send information via email, provide county telecommunications device for the deaf number if requested, which is 916-874-2599, or provide 711 California relay number if requested. Reasonable accommodations. Reasonable accommodation is a modification or adjustment that allows any person with a disability to enjoy the same benefits or services as any person without a disability. Accommodation must be available during a person's interaction with the department. Determining a reasonable accommodation is an interactive process between the person and/or representative and the employee. A person's decision about whether or not to supply any disability information is completely voluntary and must be treated with confidentiality. It is not appropriate to diagnose the degree of a person's disability or to request a diagnosis. However, it is appropriate to ask a person if they need assistance, and if so, what kind, clarify directions given and information received from a person, allow another individual brought by a person to help complete paperwork, adjust the length of the meeting to meet a person's needs, or change the location of an in-person meeting to meet a person's needs. Documentation. Employees shall maintain referral and case record documentation in sufficient detail regarding the use of effective language, auxiliary aids, alternate services, and reasonable accommodations in order to permit a reviewer to determine the department's compliance with regulations. Please refer to the Division Documentation Guidelines. You should also document that you reviewed the Pub 13 for CPS or IHSS or the Pub 470 for APS. You should document the review of the CS-106 DCFAS Special Skills Request, the CS-106B, the DCFAS American Indian Ancestry Questionnaire, and the CS-107 DCFAS Request for Accommodation Disability Form, and this is for the CPS division. You should document the review of the CS-106 DCFAS Special Skills Request and the CS-107 DCFAS Request for Accommodation Disability Form, and this is for the SAS division. You need to document the special skills language or culture worker request, assignment, and ongoing contact. You should document the offer of free county-provided interpretive services. You need to document the need to disclose confidential and sensitive information to county-provided interpreters, and the release of confidential information between an outside interpreter and the customer. Documentation should also include potential problems of ineffectual communication, conflict of interest, and inaccurate interpretation, the availability of county-supplied interpreters when the person's interpreter is not available, and the right to switch to county-provided interpreter services at any time. Over the next 4 slides, we'll be going over some documentation examples. Number 1, the Pub 13 discussed and a copy given to the client, CS-106, CS-106B, and CS-107 discussed and signed. The client-advised interpreter services are available if needed at no cost. The client reviewed the CS-106 and CS-107 and declined accommodation for language, culture, and disabilities. Number 2, the Pub 13 discussed and a copy given to the client, CS-106, CS-106B, and CS-107 discussed and signed. The client-advised interpreter services are available if needed at no cost. The client reviewed the CS-106 and the CS-107 and requested a special skills African American culture social worker be assigned. Number 3, the client speaks only Spanish. This special skills Spanish-speaking Latino culture social worker conducted the interview with the client in the client's primary language, Spanish. Number 4, this social worker arrived at the client's home and determined the client only speaks Hmong. This social worker spoke with the client using the client's adult daughter as an interpreter. This social worker will return to interview the client with a Hmong interpreter. Number 5, the client only speaks Vietnamese. This social worker arranged for a Vietnamese-speaking interpreter to accompany this social worker on face-to-face visits with the client. The interview with the client was conducted in the client's primary language, Vietnamese. Number 6, The client declined to acknowledge the Pub 13, CS 106, and CS 107. The client did not sign the CS 106 and CS 107 forms. Documents left for the client to review. Number 7. The client is visually impaired. This social worker read the client the civil rights forms. The client did not sign the CS 107 form, but asked that all documents be read aloud and left for the client's family to review. Here's a list of references that was used in the writing of this policy. Here's a list of attachments that can be found in Policy Tech that is associated with this policy. The California Department of Social Services, Pub 13 and Pub 470, and the DCFAS CS 106 Special Skills Request, the CS 106B American Indian Ancestry Questionnaire, and the CS 107 Request for Accommodation Disability. If you have any questions regarding this policy and procedure, you can email dcfas-admin-policyandprocedures@sackcounty.net. Please make sure you put client access to effective services and reasonable accommodations in the subject line. Please make sure you complete the quiz following this training. Thank you so much and have a great day.